Let's take a look at loops in JavaScript. Loops allow us to write a piece of code and then have it repeat over and over as many times as we need it to. And we'll look at some use cases in a second, but let's just take a look at two of the common types of loops and see how we can kind of write them. So let's look at the while loop first. So it looks like this. It looks kind of like an if statement. You say while, it's a special keyword. And then you have parentheses and then these curly braces. Now, inside the parentheses, you want to put a condition in there, just like with the if statement. So you want to say, something that evaluates to like true or false, like a Boolean. So what we could do to do that, let's just create a variable. We'll call it x. And remember, you need the var in front of it. So we have this variable called x, and let's go ahead and assign it while we declare it at the same time. We can do that just by putting an equal sign and then say, let's just set it to 1. Okay, so we have this variable and it's 1. So now when I comment this out really quick, if I refresh the page, we have this variable and it evaluates to 1. So that's all that means. X just translates to 1, that's all. So let's use it in the context of this while loop. What we're going to say is while x is less than 10, okay? So as long as this condition is true, we keep repeating what's in this code block. So we'll just say, we'll just log out x to the actual browser's console. So 1, right? So that's what that's going to do. This statement is saying, okay, as long as this condition is true, run this code, okay? And when you're done running this code, go back and check and see if this condition is true or false. If it's true, run this code again. So what's going to happen here is if I were to refresh the browser right now, it would actually crash the browser. And that's because x, if it's 1, as long as x is equal to 1, it's always going to be less than 10. So this is always going to be true. So what it'll do is it'll run this, and all it'll do is log out x to the console. So you'll see a 1 out here in the console. And then once it's done, once everything's done inside here, we could do multiple things. We could even log out some text right after that. Even do math like x plus whatever, so we could do a lot inside of here. But once all the code in here is done, it's going to kind of rinse and repeat. It's going to repeat itself and check this to see if it's true or false. If it's true, it'll run it again. And that's why the browser would crash. If I were to refresh, it would just constantly log this because x is always less than 10 in this case, right? If x is equal to 1. So the way while loops work is, you don't want to write something that crashes. What we usually do at the end of a while loop, right before it loops again to check if this is true and run the code inside, is we add a little line where we increment the value of x. So if you're writing a while loop that has to do with numbers, you'll typically want to increment its value so that it changes, so that it's a different number the second time it runs through. And the way you can do that is you can just say, okay, let's take that variable x, set it equal to itself, but plus 1. Okay, so it's equal to itself plus 1. So in this case, what we'll do is we'll log out x, okay? We'll get a 1 in the browser here, and then we'll say, okay, 1 or x is equal to 1 plus 1. So now x actually technically equals 2. And so the second time it loops through here, it's going to now say, okay, now I'm 2. Is 2 less than 10? And the answer is, yeah, it is. So it's going to go and run this code again. But then it's going to go through here again and say, okay, well now let's take 2 in here, and 2 plus 1 will equal 3. So then the next time it goes through, x is now equal to 3. So it's going to keep doing that. It's just going to keep looping through and adding 1 to itself, okay, as it goes through, because it remembers the last value that x was. Remember that. It will always remember the last value that x is. So as it loops through here, it just keeps adding to itself until this is proven to be false. And that'll happen once x equals to 10 itself, right? So when it finally loops through and x is equal to 10, then this is no longer going to be true because 10 is not less than 10. They're actually equal. We know that. So let's try this now in the browser. Let's refresh. And there you go. It logged out. We can erase that. It logged out 1 all the way through 9, right? Because once it gets to 10, it's not going to log x anymore because this is not true. So it's not going to run this once it hits 10. So that's how a while loop works. Now let's look at the for loop. Okay. So the for loop is a little different. It's kind of like a while loop, but it's condensed down. It's written a little bit differently. So what we do is, again, just like the if statements, we'll say for and then put something in here in the parentheses, and then we'll have these curly braces. So inside the parentheses for a for loop, you have to put 3 statements, okay? And so the 3 statements you put are first the variable that you're using. So we had done that kind of outside of the while loop at the top here. We said var x equals 1. In this case, you write it inside of here. So you say var x. You could call it I, whatever you want. We'll call it I this time. Set it equal to 1. So that's statement number 1. Remember, you have to put 3 statements in here. The second statement you put in here is the condition. So we'll say I, let's use the same example, I less than 10. And then the third statement is the incrementer. So we would say I equals I plus 1, right? Because that's how we get it every time to loop. You know, it's going to add 1 to itself. But now there's a shorthand way you can do that. Instead of writing I equals I plus 1, you can actually write it a little bit easier by just writing I plus plus. It's the same exact thing. Okay, so now let's do the same thing. Let's say console.log. Let's do 2 lines of code in here. We'll just say hello. And then we'll also just go ahead and do this. We'll say console.log. We'll just say, do string concatenation here, plus I. Okay, so I is this variable we established here. So let's look at how this works. So follow your eyes, okay? Starting from the beginning, we set the variable, and then we no longer need to look at that anymore. We run this code, we then increment, and we check this condition. If it's true, run the code again, increment, check the condition. So you can kind of see like a loop going here. It just kind of keeps going through, and that's how for loops work. So watch, let's refresh here in the browser now. And there you go. It's looped through this code 10 times or 9 times. It's going, okay, first time, hello, it's doing this, and then it's logging this out, the word number with a colon next to it, and then we're just adding in right next to it I. We could even have a space in there. It might look a little cleaner if we do it like that. So hello, and then it just increments first. That's the very next thing it does. Then it goes to here and it says, okay, is this true still? Well, I plus plus, that means 1 plus I plus, itself essentially equals 2. So then I is 2 the second time and so on. Remember, if this confuses you, you can always just write it like this. I equals I plus 1. So that's pretty much how while loops and for loops work. So they allow you to just write code once and then loop as many times as you need to. And you can set that number right there with the maximum right there. Now, that's kind of one way you'll see them. And in terms of real-world examples, you'll see all kinds of use cases for these loops. Just one example maybe off the top of the head is, a website like BuzzFeed. If you were working on a site kind of like this, and you've got a list of things, and they're all kind of similar, right? You've got like a title and then an image, and you repeat title, image. Instead of writing code that maybe, when your mouse hovers over this image, you want these social media links to show. Let's say that's what you're trying to do. Instead of writing code, 10, 20 times, however many items there are here, you could write a loop that says, okay, let's get all of these, titles or images here. And then each time we see them, let's add this function where, when you hover over it, we show social media links. So that's just kind of an off-the-cuff, rough example of it. But I just want to give you a use case so you can start to kind of think about, how this stuff can be used. And don't try too hard to work it out right now. The more important thing is just to absorb this and really get used to this syntax of the while loops and the for loops.